Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Tuesday evening, joined by co-host Eric Ibarra, a Roman Catholic, and also a Roman Catholic professor and philosopher, Dr. Mark Spencer. Dr. Spencer, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. It's an honor to have you. I've been looking into your material for a few months. I found it extremely intriguing, especially due to the paper that I want to discuss. Just in case anybody is interested in the actual title of the paper, it's The Flexibility of Divine Simplicity, Aquinas, SCOTUS, Palamism, by Mark K. Spencer. I think you published it in the International Philosophical Quarterly. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And I'm going to put a link to it here in just a second in the chat, and I'll put it later in the description box in YouTube so everybody can kind of take a glance at it. But it's excellent stuff, and I'll let you explain really what the main purpose of the paper is here in just a moment. But let me go ahead and introduce you formally. Dr. Spencer is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is married and is a homeschooling father of 4. He is the author of over 30 articles, primarily concerning the nature of the human person and the nature of beauty, especially in the context of scholastic and phenomenological philosophy. He earned his PhD at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Before that, he earned his MA and BA from the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and he is originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan. So, Dr. Spencer, let me ask you about this paper in particular, The Flexibility of Divine Simplicity. Could you maybe just kind of give us a broad, bird's eye view of what exactly was the purpose of this paper? What were you really arguing in it?
Sure. So I suppose I had sort of two intentions here. One was to try to respond to a number of objections that have been raised to the Thomistic view of divine simplicity. Mm-hmm. And the second one was to try to work out a view of divine simplicity that synthesizes together some of the main lines of the tradition. So yeah, responding to objections, synthesizing things together. And the particular people that I ended up looking at were Aquinas, and a lot of my background is in Thomas Aquinas, so that's the basis I generally work from. And then the Franciscan view of Blessed John Duns Scotus, and then the Eastern Christian view of St. Gregory Palamas. And in particular, I was responding to 3 big objections that are often raised to divine simplicity. The first one, that divine simplicity seems to collapse together the various divine attributes. That if God is perfectly simple, then all of his attributes really are just the same thing, and we should not actually be able to distinguish between any of the attributes.
Right.
Second, that if God is simple, then all the persons, the 3 persons in the Trinity, are going to be collapsed together, and we're going to end up basically with modalism. And then third, that all the divine acts get collapsed into God. That is, that we will not be able to distinguish any of his acts. All of his acts will be one with his necessary being, and so they will all be necessary as well. God will not be able to say contingently know or will creatures, the particular creatures that he knows and wills in this world. Instead, all of God's acts will be necessary. And I think that these are serious objections, and I think they're objections that the Thomistic view, if we just stick with what St. Thomas says, has difficulty responding to.
Yeah.
And it can do better if we incorporate Scotus's formal distinction. So Scotus says that there is a kind of distinction that can be drawn between intelligible contents in a being. So, for example, you are both rational and animal. You have just one essence, rational animality, but it has 2 aspects, right? 2 distinct contents, rationality and animality. And those are distinct in you even before we start thinking about you. They're not merely conceptually distinct. That is, they're not merely distinct from our point of view. And they're not really distinct. That is, they're not distinct things in you or distinct properties. Rather, they are distinct aspects or contents in your one essence. And so likewise, we can distinguish various contents in God, say God's goodness, God's power, God's mercy. They're not really distinct. So there's not distinct parts, or accidents, or properties in God, but they're also not merely conceptually distinct. They're not just distinct from our point of view and from the distinctions we make with our minds. So I think introducing this distinction helps answer the first two objections. And then St. Gregory Palamas introduces this, this distinction between God's ousia, his essence, and God's energeiai, his activities. And the distinction here again is not between two entirely distinct things. Rather, it's a distinction between, we might say, a subject and its acts, or that which is manifested and that which makes it manifest. But this allows us to distinguish between God and his contingent acts. And what I argued in the paper is these three accounts of divine simplicity are compatible with one another if we understand the basic structure of being. Right? If we can see that being itself, that is, any being whatsoever, has distinct intelligible contents in itself, and any being whatsoever manifests itself. And it manifests itself as the kind of being that it is. So if it's a free being, it's going to freely manifest itself. So then what I argue is, Aquinas argues for divine simplicity on the basis that God is pure actuality, right? The first being, the most perfect being, a being containing no passive potentiality. And so if that's right, then whatever is compatible with being is going to be compatible with God's being. Whatever is compatible with actuality is going to be compatible with God's actuality. And so then I argue that that this formal distinction and this distinction between essence and energeiai is a distinction that these are both distinctions that belong to any being whatsoever, and so they're going to belong to God as well. We can respond to the three objections, and the three views of divine simplicity turn out to be compatible with one another, so long as you make the suitable modifications.
Now, what exactly? Yeah. Now, what exactly are those modifications that you would make to Thomism specifically? Because some would argue that Thomism cannot be rehabilitated to fit Palamism. So, how would you necessarily, make those two compatible?
Yeah, right. So, what I argue is Aquinas is basically agnostic about these distinctions. He's not aware of these distinctions. He doesn't make any claims about them. And sort of from a historical point of view, necessarily so. SCOTUS and Palamas lived after him. So he's not aware of these distinctions. But what I contend is none of these distinctions are incompatible with the idea of pure act. The idea of the formal distinction, again, is an idea of distinctions, distinct intelligible contents within a single essence. We've got just one essence, just one actuality, just one form, and there are distinct intelligible contents contained in it. Aquinas is already willing to grant that there are distinct contents in God, or at least the basis for making distinct contents, distinctions among contents in God. Right? So when I distinguish, from my point of view, God's mercy and God's power, Aquinas is perfectly willing to say this is grounded in that one actuality that God is, and that it is perfectly correct to say God is merciful, God is powerful, and that mercy and power are not synonymous with one another. Right? We mean different things. So he's willing to distinguish intelligible contents in God. It's just this formal distinction gives a sort of added oomph to that, right? Little added metaphysical force to that idea, right? There really are in God these distinct contents, right? And then Aquinas is willing to say every being manifests itself, right? Every being is intelligible, every being is good, that is capable of being the object of will and appetite. Every being is beautiful, that is capable of manifesting itself to cognition and to appetite. So every being manifests itself. And I take it that Palamis's distinction between ousia and energeiai, again, is a distinction between that which is manifested and those events or acts by which it is made manifest. And so this, again, is taking something that's sort of implicit already there in Aquinas. Every being manifests itself for Aquinas. And again, it's adding a little bit of metaphysical force to that.
Are
so
you
I think
saying
there's implicit things already there in Aquinas that can be built upon by these Scotistic and Palamite distinctions.
so? Are you saying that the energies are only those things which are revealed, or there are aspects about God internally that are not revealed that are still energies?
So I take it that every energia for Palamas is a way that God acts.
Mhm.
Right? And that's also, I think, just synonymous with saying a way that God manifests himself. Now, not all of these are ways that God manifests himself to creatures.
Mhm.
So I think on Palamis's view, there are some, or at least there's the possibility of some internal self-manifestation.
So
As
there
it
would
were.
be exactly. So in the mind of Palamas, there would be, even apart from humanity, apart from creation experiencing him, there would be three distinctions: the distinction between ousia, hypostasis, and energia. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. That's
Okay.
correct. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Now, let me ask you about something that you and I were speaking through private correspondence, and you had brought up a distinction I'd never heard of before, and I want you to elaborate further on it. You had spoken about ontological versus intentional distinction within God. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit further?
Sure. So this is a distinction. It's not in the paper that you referenced.
Hmm.
It's in a book that I currently have under consideration at a academic publisher.
Hmm.
Um, but this is a distinction that I draw from a couple of different sources. So let me just run through these briefly.
Sure.
In the early modern period, right? So the later scholastic period, say around the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. A lot of the scholastic thinkers at this time were aware of these problems, right? And particularly this problem of divine activity, right? It's a problem that's very perplexing to a
Mm.
lot of these later scholastics. They recognize we need to have some way of explaining God's contingent acts, right? God contingently creates this world. He could have created some other world, but he makes this one, right? He contingently creates these creatures. He could have created some other ones. So he's got these acts of willing and knowing that are world specific, right?
Mm.
And they could have been different. Now, on the view that God is pure act, which I take it is, it follows just from any of our arguments for the existence of God, that there is a being that is pure act. God can't gain in actuality, right?
Mm.
He can't gain in perfection. When we talk about our potencies being actualized, we're talking about gaining in actuality. We're talking about gaining in perfection. We become more real normally when we act. We become more perfect, more complete normally when we act. Well, God's pure actuality, and he can't become more complete. He can't become more perfect. So his acts can't actualize him. But his acts surely are something, right? They're not just nothing. They're not just relations from our point of view. God really knows us. He really loves us, and so forth. Now, in Aquinas, this is explained by saying God's acts are relations of reason. Right? A relation of reason is a relation that is posited by a mind. It
Mm.
doesn't involve any actual dependence of the subject of that relation on the object of that relation. So a real distinction, for example, would be the relation my children have to me,
Mm.
right? The childhood relation, right? The son of or daughter of relation. They are actually dependent for their being, at least for the origin of their being, on
Right.
me. Okay, so Aquinas says God's relations to creatures, his acts of knowing and loving, are relations of reason. And the early modern scholastics say, well, that doesn't seem to quite cut it, right? God really knows us and he really loves us, right? Yet he can't gain in actuality. So they say, well, there's got to be some other sort of relation. And they don't really have a category for this. They say it can't involve actual dependence. It can't be a new being or a new accident, but it's got to be something more than a relation of reason. Okay, fast forward to the 20th century then. A 20th century philosopher, Norris Clark, who taught at Fordham University until he died 10, 15 years ago, he says we can call this new sort of relation an intentional relation. Right? When philosophers talk about intentional, that doesn't mean like done on purpose. It means directed towards some object. Right? So seeing is an intentional relation. Knowing is an intentional relation. Willing is an intentional relation. So the idea here is we can have an experiential relation, a conscious relation, an object-directed relation that does not involve an augmentation in being. It does not involve an additional perfection. A third philosopher I want to bring in is another current philosopher. He's still alive, the Austrian phenomenological philosopher Joseph Seifert. And Seifert makes a very similar distinction. We can distinguish between a thing insofar as it is perfected in being, and then a thing insofar as it has experience and act over and above that. Okay, so the idea here is God can have variable acts. God can have variable experiences. That is, experiences that would have been different had he created a different world. Not necessarily variable over time. And that does not entail an augmentation in his being, in his perfection. And we explain this through this idea of the intentional relation. And I further explain this then by drawing another distinction that SCOTUS makes. So SCOTUS says, so long as a knower, a being capable of knowledge, has the form or the actuality of the object that he or she knows in his or her mind, and is in the presence of that object, he or she will automatically come to know that object, right? Without any augmentation in being, without any augmentation in perfection. It doesn't involve taking on a new level of perfection, so long as you already have that form contained in your mind. Well, God already has all the forms of all possible beings contained in his mind, and he's automatically in the presence of any being whatsoever that exists. And so God will automatically come to know those beings in this intentional or object-directed way without that requiring any augmentation, any addition in the perfection of his being.
Okay.
So no change at the ontological level. He's pure act at the ontological level, but he can have these additional acts at the experiential or intentional level, and we can call those acts energiae in Palamis's sense.
Now, there's one other question that I want to ask before getting to Eric and his questions, and then we'll come back around and ask a few more, and we'll do some live chat. So for Gregory Palamas, would you say that he would say God's essence and being are distinct? Because when we look at Aquinas, it seems that he indicates, well, he does speak about the distinction between being and essence, but he says in God they're identical.
Right.
Would Palamas make this distinction, or would he too say that they are identical?
I think that, or at least various Palamites have said that we need to distinguish between God's essence and God's being. The key here, though, I think, is the way to reconcile these apparently incompatible claims is that I think when Palamas says ousia and when Aquinas says essentia, they don't mean the same thing. And I think a lot of problems have arisen in this debate between Thomists and Palamites because people assume that when each says essence, they mean the same thing as the other one. So I take it that when Aquinas says essence, he means what God is. And when he says what God is, he means the whole of God, all of God's being, God's pure actuality. But when Palamas says ousia, or essence, what he means is not the whole of what God is. Rather, he means what I'm going to call one formality within God. That formality which underlies all the other formalities. That content in him that underlies all the other contents, the basis for all of his self-manifestation. That which is never manifested in itself, but is always manifested through his activities. So if we introduce this formal distinction into God, this distinction among intelligible contents into God, then we can distinguish within God's one being, his one Thomistic essence, a Palamite essence and some Palamite activities.
Mhm.
All of those would be one in being with the one actuality that God as a whole is.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Eric, let me give you a chance to, jump in here, ask your questions, and then I'll ask some of mine later.
Yeah, thank you for coming on here.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great explanation, in particular about the lack of augmentation in God as he comes to experience creatures in creation. This is this is not just a debate between Palamites and Thomists. This is going on. This has been going on for a long time, as you know, and sometimes people have been mistaken to think that this somehow flew over the head of the scholastics. They were definitely, concerned about this gap in thought, and it's coming up again today in the world of evangelicalism. And some have just thrown themselves to the other pendulum of saying that there really is becoming in God. I think it's called the open theism debate, and a lot of Reformed theologians who are otherwise committed to the old classical Reformed Thomism that was there in like a Francis Turretin, for example. Even they are sometimes trying to say that, well, we've got to allow some sort of transition in God, because if we're going to have a relationship between A and B, but only B is transited, it just doesn't amount to a relationship. And you get this like in Dr. John Frame. He's a Reformed professor. I think I'm not sure if he's changed faculty, but he used to teach at I think Reformed Theological Seminary. But in any case, bringing this to the Palamite debate with Thomists, one of the big simplified questions that a lot of Palamites have for Thomists, and which they think they have the answer for, is how do we get God into creation? It's very often that I will get a phone call or an email from somebody, and they'll say they just can't understand how St. Thomas Aquinas can account for the Holy Spirit coming and hovering over the Virgin Mary, or any of the divine acts that happen in creation. So Palamas is, he just makes the proper distinction and gets God into creation, no problem. For the Thomist, there's this impenetrable wall, and there's no being, no becoming in being. There's no transited type of activity in the being of God, and so everything is sort of these created effects that are coming out of the mind of God, but have always been there in eternity past. What would you say is a way that we could? And I understand what you're saying when you said St. Thomas Aquinas is not really working with these distinctions. It really didn't. It almost seems like he anticipated some of the objections. I'm thinking in regards to freedom and necessity, but he doesn't really. In my reading of Aquinas, he doesn't really come at this with the activities and divine activities which are contingent in creation, and that unconditional, undifferentiated nature of God. Otherwise, I think he would have talked about it more directly. But how could we bring this down to a very simplified answer? And I know it's not easy, because this has been a question that has been scratching the head of so many theologians for so long. But it seems as though the Eastern Orthodox and to some degree the Coptic Orthodox as well, even though this doesn't really, it's not prevalent in their theology. More so in the Chalcedonian Orthodox that comes out from the from the Palamite tradition. They think that they alone have this solved, and it almost seems as though they present it in such a way as if it's so entitled by the premises. What could a person who is wanting to be faithful to the divine simplicity doctrine in Aquinas say on a very simplified level of how to get God into creation, where even though we say he's infinite, there's no time-space transition in God, how can we get him into a time-space transition so that way when the Virgin Mary is being impacted by the Holy Spirit is what sanctified the womb and brought about this mysterious gestation of God the Son.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying. But it's a very you've been talking about it already, so I don't want to make it sound like you didn't cover it. But the Orthodox and some of our Eastern listeners, they're pretty insistent on us trying to give some sort of a, yes, we understand how Palamas, his doctrine solves that. Here's what we could say underlying.
Yeah, so I mean, again, as I've been saying, my whole project is bringing these together. So I personally, I like the Palamite solution. It does a lot. I want to incorporate it into my metaphysics. And but what I will say to this is, I think there's a definite space in Thomism and in Aquinas' system for plugging it in on the sorts of issues that you're talking about, and that's in the area of what Aquinas calls the divine missions. So a lot of times when this debate gets discussed, there's this whole debate about created and uncreated grace that goes on between Thomists and Palamites. There's a lot of emphasis on what Aquinas says about created grace, right? That sanctifying grace is an effect, right? It's a creaturely effect, maybe not properly a creature because it's an accident, but it's created in some sense. It's on the side of creation rather than on the side of God. Right, so then it looks like we're not really divinized, we're not really sharing in God. Rather, we're just getting this, created effect that somehow proportions us to God. Right. But I think it's important to see that without bringing in Palamas, that's only half the story for Aquinas. The other half of the story is what's going on in God when we receive grace or when the incarnation occurs, right? And when God the Son is incarnate in the womb of the Virgin. The other side of it, the other side besides the created effect, the created grace, is that God the Son or God the Spirit or both are sent to a particular creature and come to indwell that creature. And Aquinas explains this, and the later Thomists also explain this in the following way. So they say within the Trinity, you've got these processions. Right, the Son proceeding, being begotten of the Father, and then the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, or from the Father through the Son. And these same processions can come to be, as the later Thomists put it, terminated by creatures. They can sort of come up against creatures. The idea here being that same procession which eternally happens in the Trinity can take as its terminus, its aim, its goal, a particular creature, whether that be you at your baptism, or you when you receive some actual grace, or Our Lady, or what have you. Okay, so that's the idea in Thomism. Now, I don't think that's entirely well developed. I think we need a little bit more in order to know what is this termination, this running into creatures. And so here's where I think that the Palamites actually have a really great sort of metaphysical way of explaining what's going on with these terminations, these intersections of the divine persons with creation. They say, well, we can make this distinction between God's eternal and absolutely unchanging ousia, which is partially manifested in these activities. Right? So every time the persons are sent, they receive a new termination. Well, what's a new termination? It's an energia, right? It's an activity. So that's just to take what's already there implicitly in Aquinas and again, sort of beef it up, right? Make it a little more metaphysically robust.
Yeah, and that's my studies in Palamism haven't been as extensive as in Aquinas, but one of the issues that I've seen with the Palamite doctrine is that works on a metaphysical theory, what you just said. We have this intersection here with this distinction of a manifesting character. It has the different termination, call it an energy. But they call it an uncreated energy. Mm-hmm. So, and for for a Thomist, we're all faced with this, this wall that separates God and creatures, mm-hmm. and what it almost appears as if what Palamos is doing is saying, okay, he wants to keep the wall there because infinitude is not finitude. Mm-hmm. Uncreation is not creation. So he wants to keep a wall there. But on one side, he wants to say this uncreated thing never gets the form of created stuff, but something uncreated can cross that wall and stay uncreated. Mm-hmm. That's what's confusing to a lot of people. And I've not really seen an Orthodox theologian or philosopher or a Catholic philosopher who is bent in incorporating the Palamite distinction explain how that can be. Because I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Eric Moscal, but he was an old Anglican Thomist from the early 20th century, and he had a famous dialogue that he sort of made a caricature of between a Palamite and a Thomist. Mm-hmm. And the Thomist would say, yes, God's being is divinely simple, pure act. And then the Palamite would say, well, then you can't get God into the creature anymore. And then the Thomist will turn around and say, well, if what you're saying comes into creation, then it loses its divine aseity and is no longer God. And then the Palamite turns around and says, no, it is God because I can break them into the energies and essence. Is there an explanation that you know of that would say this is how we can get uncreation through the wall that separates uncreation and creation, and then it stays uncreated on the other side?
Yeah. So here's how I try to understand this.
Yeah.
Because again, as I say, I want to have this in my metaphysics. I think
sure. Yeah.
And so again, I think we need to go back to looking at what's the basic structure of a being. What is it to be a being? That's what I always go back to. Right. Because if something is compatible with being a being, then it's compatible with God, because God is a being. So to be is to manifest oneself. Right? And we see this, for example, in Aquinas's account of the transcendentals, those properties that accompany every being, or are ways of looking at any being. Any being is intelligible. Any being can be the object of appetite. Any being manifests itself. Any being reveals itself. Now, every being reveals itself according to the kind of being that it is. So you're going to reveal yourself in a human way. A dog's going to reveal itself in a canine way. And God is going to reveal himself in a divine way. And to be divine, right, is to be personal, right? To be rational, to be free, and then all the other attributes, right? To be merciful, to be loving, and so forth. And so God is going to manifest himself in these ways, necessarily. Now, if God is free, then God is going to reveal himself freely. And to be free is to be able to do otherwise than you have done, right? To be able to have done something different than what you in fact did. I take it that that's a necessary condition for freedom.
Sure.
So God is going to have then some contingent self-manifestations, some contingent acts. But we've already seen, I think we've already got good reason to say God is pure actuality, right? Everything that is in God is really identical to everything else in God, which means that they are one in being. It doesn't mean that they are, say, logically convertible with one another, but it means that they are the same actuality. So I've got this idea of an actuality or a being as something that can manifest itself and then acts that, as it were, flow forth. Right? And I know that's a metaphor, but it's the best I can do. Flow forth from that that fundamental subject, that core of what it is to be that being. So if we put all this together with God, then we've got God in whom everything is one in being, right? And so in which everything is uncreated, since his being is uncreated. But that being necessarily manifests itself, and since he's a free being, necessarily manifests itself in contingent ways. And so all these crossings of the barrier, as you're putting it, are going to just be God, right? God in his uncreated being, as he chooses to manifest himself in creation.
Yeah, that's okay. So there we are at the I would say at the boundary of human limitation on this.
Yeah.
You know, we have to say God is manifesting himself, and it's in creation.
And it's really God who's manifesting himself, not just his effects.
That's right. And at the same time, we wouldn't say that the burning bush, that the trunk of that tree and the leaves of that tree were eternally burning, as if the tree is uncreated and the leaves are or when God comes down on Mount Sinai and there's lightning and thunder and there's shaking in the ground. This is a manifestation of God, but the rumbling in the ground is not eternal. And the lightning coming down from the clouds, it's not like it was always happening and now we just realized it was happening.
Yeah.
So there's this contingent use of beginning and end, space, matter, creatures. So yeah, I'm with you there. I think that's the limitation is that we have to admit that this is because what the Palamite might say, the one who's trying to undermine the doctrine of pure act, or rather undermine the Thomistic ability to account for this, is they're going to say that it's still not different than another created effect because God's still behind the wall in a sense. And that's why I think I don't really see a warrant for the idea that all of God comes through that wall in a sense where he can then partake of the finitude of the leaves and the trunk of the tree and the lightning and the clouds and the shaking of the earth. That we cannot say, in my opinion, and I'm a Thomist on the side of the debate here, but I really do want to bring Palamite, the Palamite metaphysic to bear with the difficulties that we're faced with. But I just don't see in other words, it's almost too gratuitous for me to say that God crosses the barrier and everything that, like the burning bush, the theophanies, and all of his created acts, those are eternal and uncreated too. But it begs the question as to why these things are partaking in the time-space format, which is not uncreated. Yeah. Nobody's going to tell you that that's uncreated.
Right. Yeah. So let me just say one thing about that, or maybe more than one thing. So on the one hand, I guess I don't have a particular position on whether any given theophany or revelation of God is a divine energy or a created effect.
Okay.
I just don't personally have it. I haven't thought about it enough to have a position on whether, say, the burning bush is the fire of the burning bush is a divine energy or a created effect. But what I do want to say, I guess, is the following. Suppose that they are all just created effects. Well, God is still acting at particular times and particular places, right? He brings about a burning bush in Mount Sinai in whatever BC, and he brings about the incarnation, right, a couple thousand years later, right, and he brings about sanctifying grace in my soul a couple thousand years after that, and in your soul, and so forth, right? So he's still acting, right? Even on a Thomistic model, he's acting at particular times in particular places and bringing about particular effects. Now, if we map that onto a Palamite model, even if none of the things we see with our senses are the divine energiae, we still have God, as it were, reaching through the barrier and bringing about this effect at this time and this other effect at this other time and place, and so forth. So it seems like we still have divine acts there. Okay, now, God is not just intellectual and free and has all the personal attributes. God's also the grounding for all created attributes, right? Any positive idea, any positive form that there is in creation, all the way down to the level of matter, is already in God in some more excellent way. And so I don't see any boundary on my metaphysics, on this synthesis of Aquinas and Palamas I have, to say that if God can reach through the boundary, so to speak, through his normal acts of willing and knowing and loving and so forth, and if God has all the forms of creatures in himself already, I don't have any metaphysical boundary for saying that God could manifest himself according to one of those forms at a given time. So he's got the content of the form of fire already in himself eternally, and he's got the content of the form of lightning in himself eternally. And so if his personal acts can, as it were, reach through the barrier and manifest himself in creation, I have no reason to see why these other acts can't also. Now, that's not to say that all of these acts are eternal in the sense that they are always happening. They're happening at some particular time and place. They are the way in which God chooses to manifest himself at that time, at that place. But it seems like we've already got the metaphysical grounding for that occurring in God.
Yeah, that first point that you made there, I think that's a pretty good one, where whether a chickmunk is cracking his teeth through a nut, that, or if it's water coming out of a waterfall, those are created effects. But then Jesus walking on water, that's God manifesting himself in a distinct way.
Yep.
Okay, this is not just like a chickmunk, gouging his teeth into a nut.
So that's also a manifestation of God in some sense.
But exactly, and that's one of the reasons why it's really difficult to always put that huge boundary between God and creation, because creation is coming out from God, or in its origin and its perpetual form. Right. But then again, there's the other ditch, which I think you would agree we should avoid, which is the Neoplatonic way of almost bringing this in, where it's like God is coming, the one is in the many, God is coming through. Yeah. And I think one gentleman, he's a scholar, he wrote a book called Theophany.
Eric Pearl.
Yes, there we go. Dr. Eric Pearl. I haven't really analyzed it enough to really give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but I almost want to say he sees that he doesn't like that boundary, between the eternal simplicity of God and that boundary in creation. But needless to say, that's a good point. What's going on in the chickmunk there, unbeknownst to anybody, that's also something outflowing from God, the first prime cause. But Jesus walking on water and all these other miraculous interventions, those are things, those are distinct things where nature is actually being overpowered. Well, I don't want to say overpowered, but nature itself is kind of
Elevated.
going,
Yeah.
it's being elevated to like a supernatural
Yeah.
action, you know.
Mhm.
And so that distinction is not superfluous. It's a real one.
Yeah. Though I think even in the case of those the miracles, say Jesus walking on the water or the light on Tabor, right at the Transfiguration, these can be given an analysis according to which they are creatures brought about by acts of divine will, or they can be given a reading on which they are divine energia, right? God literally revealing himself, right? God's acts showing up in the world. And I want a metaphysics that allows me to take either of those interpretations. It's just I'm personally currently agnostic as to which analysis I want to give to any of those particular effects.
Right.
They're supernatural either way.
Right.
I'm just not sure which one is the right analysis of each particular event.
But you've done well at defining some of the tools that are available there, to work that out. Yeah. Michael, I'm done. I'm glad we had him on. This is great stuff.
Yeah,
I think that we got some good answers here.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think that the most answers I've really had out of any paper that I've read was from yours. Let me ask you this, Dr. Spencer. One thing that I've wrestled with is, let me just put it like this. If the essence is wholly in each energy, as we see in Palamism, how is it that participable energies are not actually participations in the essence?
Yeah. So here again, just like I said with essence, I think we need to distinguish different senses of participation. So again, when the Thomists say, or when Aquinas says participation, and when Palamas says participation, I don't think they mean the same thing. So when Aquinas says participation, he says, for example, that we participate in God's existence, or we participate in God's goodness. What he means is we have these characteristics partially, and we have them because God has them essentially. Right? So God is a sort of exemplar or standard for the properties that we have. When Palamas says participation, like when he talks about us participating in the energies, he means directly making contact with and taking on the characteristics of something. Right? So we come into direct contact, as it were, and again, that's a metaphor, but we come into direct contact with the energies and take on their characteristics directly. Right? We share in, and in some way completely share in, the characteristics of those energies. Now, on the Thomistic definition of participation, participation is a transitive relation, right? If A participates in B and B participates in C, then A participates in C. So on the Thomistic account of participation, I think we can say we do participate in the divine ousia, right? The Palamite essence. Since I participate in the energies, and the energies in some sense participate in the essence, I participate in the essence. But on Palamas's definition of participation, where it's just a taking on of the characteristics of something else, it's not a transitive relation. And so I can't say that because I participate in the energies, I therefore participate in the essence. So I think we just have two different terms here. They're being used with different definitions. And if we just distinguish the definitions, at least from my point of view, the problem goes away.
Okay. Now, in your paper, you were talking about the views of Aquinas necessarily leading to the formal distinction of SCOTUS. You say that the Aquinas's view of substance and intrinsic relations necessarily lead to the SCOTUS formal distinction. Did I get you right is that in fact what you were saying?
I think that's what I said in the paper. I mean, you're reading it to me. So
now can you walk me through that? Because
I said that in the paper. I'm not sure I want to defend that strong of a claim anymore. So it's been a few years since I wrote that paper. I don't think I'd want to say that it necessarily leads to the formal distinction I guess what I want to say now is something weaker. That is, the formal distinction is helpful. It's helpful in making sense of the different sorts of intelligible contents that we find in a being, on Aquinas' view or on anyone's view. And so Aquinas is willing to say, in any being whatsoever, that being can be understood as a being, as good, as intelligible, as one. So he says all of these are distinct meanings, they are distinct contents in a being, and yet they're all really identical to the being, right? Your being and your unity and your goodness and your intelligibility and your beauty are all really identical on Aquinas' view. And likewise for God's being and unity and intelligibility and so forth. And so we might say, well, how's that possible, right? Unity, being, goodness, intelligibility, these mean different things. Well, I think the SCOTUS formal distinction is helpful here. We can say there are distinct intelligible contents in a being, right? In you, in God, in any being. And they are intelligibly distinct prior to anyone understanding the being, right? They're not just distinct because we make these conceptual distinctions, but they don't amount to a real distinction. They don't amount to different beings, different accidents, different perfections. They are different aspects of one and the same perfection, one and the same being. So I think it's helpful there, but I wouldn't want to say anymore that the one necessarily leads to the other. I don't think that's the case.
Now, the issue of the beatific vision, sometimes you hear this disputed in Eastern Orthodox circles. So my question here is, it seems that Palama seems to say that we don't see the essence at all. Instead, we just see the energies. But Aquinas seems to say that we actually do see the essence of God by grace, not fully. We never fully comprehend God, but we apprehend by grace God's essence in the beatific vision. How can we reconcile these two different schools of thought since it seems that they appear to be at odds?
Yeah, so here I think that distinction that I drew earlier between the two senses of essence is helpful. So again, as I said before, the Thomistic essence, when Thomas says the essence of God, he means God's being, God's full reality. God in himself, and all of those energies, all of those activities are one, really one, with the essence in that sense. So to see an energy on this view is to see the divine essence in that sense. It's to see God's being. But the divine ousia, the Palamite essence, right, the essence as Palamas understands it, is this, as it were, core of who God is. This formality in God, this aspect of God that underlies all of the self-manifestations, all of the ways in which he makes himself manifest. And to see this formality, to see this essence, would be to comprehend God. Which Aquinas says we never do. So I think we can reconcile them just by distinguishing those senses. We see God's Thomistic essence, we see God's being, God's esse, and we see it by God's self-revelation, by one of his activities, by the way in which he makes himself manifest to our minds. But we never see God's essence in the Palamite sense. No being distinct from God could see God's essence in that sense.
Seems a lot of these questions then hinge on how we define our terms and not equivocating them and assuming that they're, that they're going to be identical. I'm sorry, univocal.
I think so.
Let's go to a couple questions. I have something from. It looks like this one is from CS. He always asks some good stuff. So let's go to see what he has to say. Does God have the forms in his mind of things that humans create, or do forms exist that are co-created?
Okay, so I take it that, and I guess he can jump on here and correct me if I'm misunderstanding this.
He's giving a
sport, for example.
Okay,
I guess that answers my question. Could you put the first question back up?
Yes.
So we're talking about the forms of artifacts, right? Of human invented things. So I guess on my view, and it's just my view, but on my view, God is the source of all being. Any being that can possibly exist in on the side of creatures, any form, any actuality that can exist on the side of creatures already exists in God. The content of it, at least, not the literal created form itself, but the content of that form already exists in God from all eternity. So all of the contents of any form that we could create, right? Any artifact we could make, any action we could perform, is already contained in God in a more excellent way. Now, I don't think it follows from that God, say, dictates to us what we're going to create, or God determines what we're going to create or what we're going to do. It's just to say, whatever I do, I can only do insofar as I'm a being. Whatever I do, I can only do insofar as I share in the being that has been made available to me, and all of that being ultimately comes from God. And so all of these forms are already in God in some way.
Okay, I am trying to get to the next one on here because some of the ones that I just pulled up appear to be ones that we've really already answered. Here's another one from CS, though. Let me pull it up. Would it be fair to say that the West requires a distinction between essence and substance, and the East does not take this into account?
So I think, at least on Aquinas and Scotus's view, we're going to need to distinguish between essence and substance when it comes to creatures, right? So a substance is a being that exists in itself, right, and not an accident, not a property or an attribute of another. So I'm a substance, right? You're a substance. Dog is a substance. God is a substance. When it comes to creatures, we can make a distinction between the substance, the thing itself, and what that thing is. And we need to make this distinction for a couple of reasons. First of all, because you are not just what you are. You are not just humanity. Right? The dog is not just caninity. It also has some accidents, some other properties over and above that essence. It also has some particular matter. Right? So here I am, I've got humanity, and I'm in this matter, and you've got humanity, and you're in that matter. So I've got my matter, I've got my accidents. So there is more to me as a substance and as a being than my essence. Furthermore, my essence can be conceived of apart from its existence. Right? We can grasp essences apart from their existence. For example, I can grasp the essence of a unicorn or a phoenix, that's Aquinas' example, without knowing whether or not it exists. And so existence seems to be something added on to the content of essences. And so again, there's more to a substance than just its essence. It also has existence, real existence. So we need to make that distinction in creatures, but we don't want to make that distinction in God. God just is what he is, at least when we're talking about the Thomistic essence. If we introduce then this idea of the Palamite essence, the ousia that I've been talking about, that core of what God is, then I think there we would make a formal distinction between God's essence and God's substance, or God as a whole, God the entire being. And so for that reason, I think this is a distinction that we find in the East. And I'm not, as much of a scholar of the Greek fathers as I am of Aquinas and the Thomistic tradition, but I think you can find a parallel distinction between essence and substance in the East as well.
Now, this one is from Bunzai. He says, why cannot God be complex but free of any corruption so God retains wholeness and completeness? So, why can't he be a complex being without there being corruption? Because, normally you hear that complexity requires corruption or requires even something prior to it to put it into composition. So,
yeah, good. So I guess this view that God is complex, that is, made of parts, whether those parts be physical parts, temporal parts, substance and accident, essence and existence, whatever sort of part you have in mind. So this is a view that's very common. Eric, you mentioned, or one of you mentioned, the open theist position,
Right.
this position that God develops over time. So this would be a view that God is complex, but certainly free of corruption. Here's why I don't think this view is available. It has to do with what we take to be the grounds for saying that God exists. What are our reasons for thinking that God exists in the first place? And to my mind, the best reasons we have for thinking that God exists in the first place, before we have any conception of faith or a particular religion being right or a particular revelation being right, the basic reasons we have for thinking that God exists are arguments like Aquinas' 5 ways. So in these ways, we reason from change in creatures back to a first condition for change occurring in creatures. And the basic idea is in creatures, we have this movement from potency to act, from being able to have a property to actually having that property. And if we reason through this chain of changes, this change of reduction of potency to act that we find in creatures, this can only be explained, it could only have come about if there's a starting point, if there is a first beginning to all of these changes that we find in creatures. Well, the first beginning would have to be pure act, would have to be pure actuality. If the so-called first beginning had some potentiality, then it would need to be actualized. And so we would not have a starting point. We would not have an ultimate explanation for the changes we find in creatures. So there must be a being that's pure act. But to say that as being is pure act is to say that it has no potentiality. And that's to say it's not made out of parts, which is to say that it is not complex. Now, Michael, earlier you asked me about my distinction between the ontological and the intentional or experiential level.
Mm-hmm.
When we do these sorts of analyses in terms of potency and act, we're operating entirely on the ontological level. We're talking entirely about the being of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? This sort of level of metaphysical analysis. And so to say that God is pure act is to say that he has all the perfection that it's possible for a being to have, right? Complete perfection, complete being, complete actuality. But it's not to say that God can't, say, have variable experiences, variable intentional acts, right? That he can do otherwise than he did, and so forth. So long as we make that distinction between the ontological and the experiential level, or between the ontological and the energeia level, which I think are the same thing.
Now, Kyle is asking, how can you reconcile Palamis's teachings of uncreated energies constantly changing and becoming bigger or smaller, yet Aquinas affirmed in his 5 ways that God can't be able to change?
Yeah, good. So I would use that exact same distinction I was just talking about here. So if we distinguish between that ontological level of analysis, right, when we're talking about potency and act, right, the level at which we analyze things into substance and accident, essence and energy, form and matter, these sorts of things, God is unable to change at that level. God is unable to change in his ontological actuality. God cannot become more perfect, more complete, or less perfect, or less complete than he is. So at that level, God cannot change. But God is an actuality. That is, God is a being. And so any properties that necessarily belong to beings must belong to God. One of the properties that I think necessarily belongs to beings is action, right? Intentionality, or what I'm calling, following Palamas, energeia. So God, being pure actuality, must also have energies, activities. And since, again, God is a free being, these energies are going to be variable. They're going to be able to be different, at least in different possible worlds. And so in this way, God is unchanging in the sense that Aquinas means change, right? In the sense that follows from the 5 ways, but that still leaves open the possibility of God changing in ways that are not being discussed in the 5 ways.
Okay. Got another good one from CS. He asks,
Yeah.
dogmatically, what would need to be changed in the Catholic Church to integrate Palamas? Would this require council to overturn previous statements? What are your thoughts?
I'm not a dogmatic theologian. I have good friends I always go to check these things. I can look things up in Denzinger, but I always miss stuff. But to my knowledge, nothing that the Catholic Church has taught excludes the essence energies distinction. That is, I can't think of any. You might think, for example, I think it's at Lateran 4. There's the claim there that God is in every way simple. Right? Omnino simplex, I think, is the phrase that's used there. So I think, okay, God is in every way simple. But I take it what that means is God is in every way simple that is compatible with the other things that have been dogmatically defined about him. So, for example, God's simplicity is still meant to be compatible with real distinction among the three persons. Right? So you could think of a way in which God is in every way simple, where God is just a perfect point, right? Has no distinction in him at all. And that's not the sense in which the Catholic Church means it, right? Because the Church affirms the one simple God is also identical to three persons who are really distinct from one another. So if we understand God is in every way simple to mean God is in every way simple that's compatible with other stuff that the Church teaches, then that I think leaves open the possibility of God's simplicity being compatible with formal distinction, with essence energy distinction, maybe with other possible distinctions as well, so long as they don't render God multiple beings or multiple actualities. But if there are other dogmatic points that I'm not thinking of or not aware of, people should raise them and see what I think.
Sure. Now, this one you kind of touched on previously at the beginning of the program. Does Aquinas ever have a formal distinction between God's essence and energies? And then he goes on to say, because I think in question 11 of the first part, he only says it's a virtual distinction because we are composite beings.
Yeah. So Aquinas in the Thomistic tradition certainly introduces a virtual distinction between God and some of his acts, where a virtual distinction means there's a distinction in the sense that he has the power to bring something about. And that's a kind of conceptual or logical distinction. Aquinas never introduces the idea of a formal distinction. He's unaware of that possibility. He never distinguishes an essence-energy distinction. Again, he's unaware of that possibility. So my claim is not that this stuff is in Aquinas. My claim is that Aquinas's metaphysics, sort of unbeknownst to him, has space to incorporate this stuff into it. And one other thing, let me say one other thing about that. Sure. I don't think the distinction between essence and energies should be equated to the formal distinction. Formal distinction is a distinction among intelligible contents in a being that are necessarily in that being. So way back at the beginning of the session, I distinguished between rationality and animality in the human essence. Both of those necessarily belong to the human essence. But the energies, at least some of them, are supposed to be variable or contingent. They could be different in different possible worlds. So I don't think SCOTUS's formal distinction will work there, because they are not all necessarily in God. God doesn't necessarily act in these ways. So I think the essence energies distinction should be understood as a unique kind of distinction. It doesn't map onto the scholastic formal or conceptual or virtual or real distinction.
Now, you had mentioned, okay, that Aquinas perhaps makes space for some of these things. Does he just make space for some of these things, or would you argue that there still are some aspects to Aquinas that would necessarily lead to a Palamite perspective?
Again, I'd be loath to say that they necessarily lead to it. I guess I'm loath to say that because I don't want to say that, he should have seen this or he should have understood this, or there were sort of entailments he didn't recognize. So that's why I'm not comfortable attributing those things to any major thinker, really any thinker at all. What I'd like to say, though, rather, is they can make sense of things that are problematic or underexplained in Aquinas, and Aquinas's claims do not positively exclude them.
Now, here's a real good one from Emil.
Mm.
He says, without the energy essence distinction, how do we participate directly with God in the Eucharist? Are we participating with the essence? So, according to the Thomistic perspective, how is it that we are really participating in God? Are we participating in his essence unless we hold to the essence and energy's distinction?
So certainly I wouldn't want to say that we are participating in the essence in the sense that Palamas understands it, that Palamite ousia. The Palamite ousia is necessarily unparticipated, it's necessarily unknown, it's what cannot be grasped by any creature, it's what is in and of itself, at least, unmanifested. So we're never participating in the essence in that way. I think that anytime we participate in God, we're participating in the essence in Aquinas' sense, right? Because the essence in Aquinas' sense just is God. To participate in God is to participate in his essence in the sense that Aquinas understands that word. Now, again, I think this is a place that's underdeveloped in Aquinas. So God comes on a mission to us. God the Son comes on a mission to us in the Eucharist. He makes himself present to us in a new way in the Eucharist. His eternal procession from the Father is terminated in us in a new way. Right? It comes to us, it runs into us in a new way when we receive the Eucharist. And so we are participating in God in a particular way. But like I say, I think that's underdeveloped in Aquinas. We can still ask, well, what does that mean? In what sense are we participating in him? And so here I think the essence-energy distinction can help us a lot. Right? This is a particular divine activity in which we come to participate, through which we share in God himself.
Okay, let's take one more. Some guy said in chat recently that Father Gergru Lagrange denied SCOTUS's formal distinction could reconcile a real distinction and a distinction of reason. Is this true?
Yes. Gergru Lagrange, and really most of the Thomistic tradition deny that there could be such a thing as a formal distinction. So the Thomists are uncomfortable with this. And I mean, this goes for plenty of Thomists nowadays. And if you look at the whole Thomistic tradition back through the late medieval and early modern period, likewise, they're uncomfortable with a formal distinction because they think a real distinction and a distinction of reason sort of cover all the conceptual space when it comes to kinds of distinctions. A real distinction is a distinction among beings or properties of beings. A rational distinction is a distinction we make with our minds about beings. And they say there's no other space. Either the distinction is there in reality or it's made by our minds. And there's no further space for other kinds of distinctions. The Scotists, and here I'm following the Scotist tradition rather than the main lines of the Thomist tradition, says, no, there's the possibility of there being these distinct contents out there in reality, right? Not just in our minds, but that don't amount to distinction in being, distinction in accident, and so forth. It's to introduce, as it were, another metaphysical category, another kind of item out there in the world that the Thomists don't think that we can introduce. So that's the debate there, and that's what's at stake in the debate.
I have one final question, then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. My question is this, and you kind of touched on it a little bit just a moment ago, but maybe if you could elaborate a little bit further, because you do take this up in your paper. You note that the SCOTUS position does not necessarily deal sufficiently with the third objection that you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video, the third objection to divine simplicity. So if you could first recap what that third objection was, and then could you maybe explain how Scotism doesn't sufficiently answer that?
Sure. So that third objection was the objection that if God is simple, then all of God's acts, as it were, collapse into God. There is no way for God to have contingent acts. There's no way for God to freely create this world rather than another, freely create me rather than not create me. Because if everything in God is identical to God, then all of God's acts are going to be identical to God. And if God's mode of being is necessary, then all of these acts' modes of being is going to be necessary. Okay, so there's no way, it seems like, on simplicity to distinguish between God and his contingent acts, or even for God to have contingent acts. And so to solve the problem of distinguishing among God's attributes, I introduced this formal distinction, this distinction among distinct contents or distinct aspects of God. But as I said before, all of those formalities, right, all of those formally distinct contents in a being have to be there necessarily. Right? We're distinguishing all the contents that belong to an essence in itself. And so this still won't allow us, this formal distinction won't allow us to distinguish between God and his contingent acts, right? Because they're not there necessarily. That's why I say I think we need to, or it's helpful at least, to bring in this essence energies distinction, and why I don't think we should understand the essence energies distinction to be the same as the formal distinction. The essence energies distinction allows us to distinguish, again, between two aspects of a being that are really identical to that being. And by that, again, I mean one in being, one in actuality with that being, right? And yet one of them is necessary and one of them is contingent. Okay. Right? So it allows us to distinguish between a being and the contingent ways in which it manifests itself.
Okay. And that pretty much does it for the questions. I don't see any more in the chat. You really helped a lot here. You did. Okay. Excellent. I hope we didn't throw too many at you.
No, great.
I really do appreciate your time. I'd like to have you on again, perhaps for a roundtable discussion with individuals of other perspectives, perhaps a SCOTUS and a Palamite. If you would ever be interested, I think that would be a really interesting and fun roundtable discussion. So I can send you some names and dates if you're interested.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll get with you off the air about that. But again, thank you so much for coming on. Why don't you go ahead and put in a plug for your material? I know you have a Academia website. Let me actually pull it up because I think I have it here on my email. While I'm looking for it, throw out any other plugs that you want to add.
No, I just mentioned that. So that's my website. It's at academia.edu. Just search Mark Spencer on there. Or Michael might throw up the link to my particular page. And what I've got on there is just most, not all, but most of my published papers and a few other unpublished things are up there. So I've got stuff on God, on God's relation to our free will, on human nature, stuff on beauty and on divine beauty, some things on the soul, the human soul after death and prior to the resurrection, the separated soul. So those are some of the things I've written about, and happy to have people email me. My email's on that site, and always happy to correspond with people about this or any other topic.
And the site is stthomas.academia.edu/Mark Spencer. I'm going to include that in the description to this, so because I know that's a lot to write down. So there will be a link there. Now, I don't know if you could talk a whole lot about it, but you did mention a book that's in the works. Is it too early to discuss anything about it yet?
So it's a book on the nature of the human person. It's under consideration at a publisher right now. I expect to hear back from them probably in about 3 months or so. So it's going through peer review right now. But it's basically a synthesis of views on the human person from Aquinas, SCOTUS, Palamas, the phenomenologists, and some personalists, and a couple other scholastics too. Sort of a big old synthesis. Kind of like this paper on God on a bigger level. And the upshot of the book is I'm defending what I call the irreducibility of the human person. So it is false to say the human person is nothing but, and then fill in the blank with anything other than a person. And then furthermore, we've got lots of irreducible features within us. And I think we can defend that view best by synthesizing together the anthropologies of a bunch of different strands of the tradition.
And is that related at all to your dissertation? Because you were speaking a little bit about that earlier before the program. Is this maybe an outgrowth of that?
It is, yeah. So it's sort of a distant descendant of that. My dissertation synthesized together some work in phenomenology, with Aquinas's metaphysics of the person. This draws on that, but brings in a number of other major thinkers as well.
Excellent. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, I'll get with you off the air to find out some potential dates for a roundtable. But again, I really appreciate your time. We really enjoyed it. Eric, any concluding remarks or comments there?
No, just we're grateful for you coming on here and giving us your time. It was excellent.
Happy to do it. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Spencer. Everybody, please comment, like, subscribe, share this material on your social media. God bless you all. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, go share your faith.